What I want to do is take all we've been talking about in the previous videos dealing with the Ukraine war, the background and everything, and talk about what's going on now, what it really means, and maybe some ideas of where we're kind of going. So, first, in terms of news, we don't really know what's going on. Various people tell you, oh, yeah, we know what's going on. Look, there's pictures of things exploding, and one side's telling us how many people they killed, etc., etc. But in all honesty, what we know in terms of casualties, equipment destroyed, and the imminence of success or failure in terms of what Russia's doing to Ukraine and Ukraine to Russia, we actually have very minimal information because all the information is being filtered to us. Even earlier in the war, uh, Ukraine attempted some, I guess you'd call it propaganda attempts, where they were showing things destroyed that were questionable about whose side they were, etc. And they kind of got caught with it. And it's interesting, or mainstream media apologized for Ukraine, saying, "Oh well, it's understandable they would do that because they need to maintain morale." Well, that's true, and so are the Russians. And of course, this is a war that's being presented in, if you're watching it on mainstream media in the US, it's being compiled for your consumption. So it's not entirely about what's truthful, it's about the filter they want you to understand it through. And clearly, this is a David versus Goliath story, so that's the way it's going to be portrayed. So if you believe you have an excellent idea what's going on, I would say you don't, and we're not going to fully know what's going on until after this is over. Now, one of the things leading into the war is there's this big divide in the country over, or one side saying, well, if you aren't fully on Ukraine's side, you must be some kind of pro-Russian kook and blah 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 blah. Uh, and really, what's happening here is we're seeing the war boiled down to a couple of different aspects in terms of how people look at it. Now, one thing that was happening a lot during the 90s, RT, which is Russia Today, which you don't see anymore, used to be actually a pretty interesting source of news because they would bring on a lot of people we would consider dissidents or people who aren't mainstream views and voices, and RT would showcase them. Now, mind you, they had, because it's Russia, they had a particular goal in mind. They wanted to show dissent in the United States, and they wanted to show people who weren't happy with the status quo, especially at that time, the United States as the sole world power. And so, because RT gave such open coverage to a lot of conservatives and libertarians, to a certain extent, they endeared themselves to Russia. And on the flip side, because it was an avenue for the people who the mainstream media doesn't want to give a voice, it also soured some people, the people who didn't want to hear these voices against Russia. And ultimately, it's coming down to a view of globalism versus nationalism. People who tend to be more favorable to the globalist view are going to look at Russia as the most dangerous thing on the face of the planet. And that very well might be true in terms of the globalist view. Now, people who have a tendency to view things more through a nationalist lens, at least up until the war, probably would look at Russia as one of the major blocks towards the advancement of globalist objectives. So this is the breakdown, really, on who views what. So if you're not in favor of a globalist uh, agenda, we're heading towards a single one world government. Yeah, you're not going to be as warm to the idea of this war as somebody who looks at it as globalism's survival being on the line. Now, some of the things we talked about, understanding the criticality of Crimea. Crimea was joint occupied. As I explained, it was occupied by Russians long before Ukrainians moved in there. It's massively, probably about 90% Russian. Uh, and it was only added to Ukraine in the 1950s as kind of a gift from Khrushchev to the Ukrainians to try to show that they were one big happy country again. But the nature of Crimea never changed. When Ukraine gained its independence in the 90s, Crimea remained a joint occupied peninsula. There's very critically important, strategically important naval bases there. So Russia maintained its naval bases right up until present day. Ukrainians had some modest military setup in that area as well. Uh, One of the ways to think about this, because if you look at the river systems here pouring out into this little basin, how narrow it is between basically your ability to get out into the sea, and the fact that the main harbors are on the peninsula itself. In a lot of ways, Crimea, if we were to compare it to something similar in America, would be like New Orleans on the Mississippi. It's a main outlet for getting things from the interior of the country out to the rest of the world. Now, imagine if something crazy happened, like Louisiana uh, seceded from the United States, and it was kind of allowed to do that, and New Orleans was kind of a joint occupied harbor where the United States would move its stuff through, and Louisiana claimed ownership. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, how far would the United States go to keep using the port of New Orleans, even if it wasn't in the country proper? And this is what you have to ask in terms of Russia. Now, if you believe that if Louisiana could break away from the United States and they could do whatever they want with New Orleans from here on in, um, then you should apply the logic equally and say, okay, yeah, that's part of Ukraine and it's for Ukrainians only. But if you could see the way where it's like, well, no, if we gave up Louisiana somehow and we came up with an agreement where we were jointly using New Orleans, they'd have to uphold the agreement, and we'd be willing to put a lot of effort and force into the idea of keeping New Orleans open. Well, you kind of got to give Russians the same leeway in that mindset. Okay, so one of the things to understand about Crimea and Donbass region, Crimea is majority Russian. Portions of the Donbass, especially the areas that became separatist, are majority Russian. Now, one of the things that cropped out of World War II, because one of the things that triggered World War II, and it's a lot more complicated than what we're going to talk about here, is the idea of nationals existing outside their homeland and the homeland wanting to reincorporate these nationals in, because it was socialist Germany that used this as their primary reasoning for their initial expansions. It has left people with a very sour notion that, well, anytime any country tries to reincorporate nationals that are outside their border, it's automatically a bad thing, and it's very German socialist like to do something like that. And the question you have to say is, would we consider it legitimate if we were facing a similar situation? Just the picture being depicted there, interestingly though, is these are Germans who lived in other countries outside of what is now National Germany, uh, and after World War II, in order to eliminate the idea of starting fights beyond their border, Germans some of them who'd been living for 4 or 5 generations outside the confines of Germany, were forced relocated back to Germany. So it was, even though the idea was frowned upon, the idea of going outside your borders to reincorporate your nationals, they still recognize the idea of nationals being outside their boundaries as becoming a future problem. So they repatriated them back to Germany in order to prevent that from happening in the future. Now, when the Soviet Union broke up, no one took this into consideration, so this created a problem outside. Now, an example I'd like to throw out is, imagine if Texas seceded. And let's say most of the Hispanics in Texas gravitated towards the idea of being part of Mexico. And you still had non-Hispanic population in enclaves in Texas. If those non-Hispanic enclaves in Texas started identifying as being more in the wanting to be in the American sphere, do you think the United States would react to it? And if you say, well, I don't think they would, consider for the fact that's kind of how we got Texas in the first place, is that Texas was being jointly settled by people from the United States and Mexico, and essentially the people who'd immigrated in from America formed enclaves and essentially agitated for first independence and then reintegration back into the United States. And I'm not saying that I favor the idea of rejoining nationalities outside boundaries into their mother entity. I'm just saying is you can't completely discount it entirely because of history. We have to look at the fact that nobody thought this through when the Soviet Union broke up in the first place. It was ultimately going to end up being a problem. It should have been solved earlier, and there may be ways to solve it now without it becoming a repeat of National Socialism.